Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Menzies Research Seminar. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today or joining us online. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Professor Steve Guthridge, who'll be presenting to us on the patterns of mobility among primary school children in the Northern Territory. So I won't take too much time from his presentation. I'll welcome him up now and let him get off to it. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to talk about mobility. I've worked in health services and humans and population health research and a bit of demography over the last 30 years. And one of the enduring challenges is to try to respond in terms of service delivery and policy to the movement of the population in the Northern Territory. And we know that from ABS surveys and such that about 20% of the non-Aboriginal population move each year, but also we know that there's a substantial movement of the Aboriginal population. And that has implications across all services. It means in health that we're often seeing people unknown to the service, but also in education, there's a continuing change of classrooms as kids move in and out of classrooms, and particularly for Aboriginal classrooms. So I've done a number of projects over the years in this, and it really has been a challenge to try to document and to enumerate the levels of movement that we have. So I was very pleased to be involved with this project with Junyi and Vincent. And just to put this in a context, back in 1999, there was a major review of education, First Nations education, and there was a chapter dedicated to mobility of students. And they talked about the need for responsiveness of the Department of Education. And they came up with recommendations. First was to recognise that there are communities of affiliation between which students and families will move in a patterned way, and for the department to organise its administration to better align with those affiliated communities. The second was to draw on other agency data and liaise with various land councils and relevant organisations to map and anticipate population movement. And the third one that I draw out of these recommendations is that the department should organise school clusters to correspond with the patterns of visiting and of residents. So that's 1999, and we've been struggling to respond. What we do about it is well recognised, but what are these patterns of movement? So this study that was funded by the department has two objectives. First is to describe the patterns of mobility, in this case of primary school children across the Territory. And the second is to look at the characteristics of clusters of children with different patterns of mobility. And we're asked to do that at two levels. Firstly, for the Northern Territory as a whole, and then do a deep dive for three regions, East Arnhem, Big Rivers and Central. And so I'll describe that project. But first I need to remind you of the linked data repository that we hold at Menzies, the CIDO data repository. And in this repository, down the left, you can see examples of the 23 data sets that we hold. And so what we do in this is that individual records in any of those data sets are linked. So we can look at individuals as they appear across those multiple data sets. It's all de-identified, but within the information, we have location about where they have an event. So a date and a location in which they're seen. So 23 data sets down the left across health, education and social services, child protection, police, justice, those types of things. And across the bottom axis, you can see the dates. The earliest data starts in 1986. And as we come across, we have more and more available data as the data sets and systems became digitalised, and education kicks in 2005 for the NT government. So we use this resource or some of the data sets in this resource. And so we looked at location data for individuals by using the data sets down the left, very reliant on school enrolment and attendance in particular. But we also looked at immunisation, hospital admissions, emergency data, government primary care system, which is used across 50 remote services, NAPLAN data that we have for both government and non-government schools. And we also expected to use child protection contact data. Down the right column, you can see the types of location data: school ID data, community, suburb, locality codes, statistical local area, so Australian geographic coding that's used by ABS, clinic name in the case of primary care. NAPLAN had school ID, and I come back to child protection contact because all we have there is postcode. And just for those that don't know, postcode is useless in the Northern Territory for a range of reasons. So we ended up not being able to use child protection data, but we used location data for individuals in those other data sets and the dates at which they'd been seen. So there's three elements to this study. The first is a descriptive analysis of mobility of the children for the entire data period from 2005 to 18. Then the exciting component of this is the network analysis and looking at the relationships between communities. And I'll come back to how that works. And I'll mention the latent class analysis, which allows us to identify clusters of children with similar mobility characteristics, but also you can do an additional analysis about other characteristics of those children. So a selection of the descriptive statistics. And let me start on the left side. This is Northern Territory data across the whole period. So on the left is the number of children enrolled in primary school. The blue are the non-Aboriginal children, the red Aboriginal children, and the green is the total. And you can see, and I should just mention that vertical line, which is a break in the series. So in 2013, the Education Department upgraded its systems. It brought in much tighter definitions about its counting rules. And so we should look at these with caution, but certainly after 2013, the data is more reliable. So you can see across that time, gradual increase in the number of non-Aboriginal children, but in red, the Aboriginal children particularly increasing after 2013, which we think in part is the introduction of truancy officers and the insistence on school enrolment. There is a little bit of growth in population, but most of it's growth in enrolment of kids who otherwise weren't enrolled. So some increases in numbers. But the more dramatic changes happen in that right-hand graph, which shows the proportion of students having some level of mobility in a calendar year. And if I start at 2013, for Aboriginal children, you can see 2013-14, the mobility is running at about 15% of children moving at least once each year. But by the end of the series, at 2018, it's up over 25% of children are moving at least once. And in blue, the non-Aboriginal children hovering around that 10% level and increasing in more recent years. So a substantial proportion of primary school children moving. This is the same graphs, but just a dive into the big rivers, just to show that very similar pattern that's happening in big rivers. And this is true of the other regions as well, with that sort of change, but dramatic increases, particularly of the mobility. And here in big rivers, we're talking 30% of children moving in a calendar year. And this is the number of moves by children. On the left there, Aboriginal students, and you can see the numbers increasing dramatically. The blue is moved once in the year, and we've had an increase in those children moving once in the NT, across the NT, but also those that move twice which are the orange, and the greatest increase has been moved among those that are moving multiple times, which is the grey band. On the right, non-Aboriginal students who are almost always moving only once during the school year. And this is where they're moving. The blue is to NT government schools. The orange is to non-government schools in the NT, and the grey is interstate movement. And so in the blue, most of the increase has been mobility of Aboriginal students between government schools. But to my surprise is the proportion who are also moving interstate, particularly in the Big Rivers region. And non-Aboriginal students right through the whole time series of both periods, you can see that the majority of movement is interstate movement. So let me go on to the GEFI and explain what GEFI is and make sense of that graph on your left. Is that what GEFI does, it's most often used for human interactions, and it's used for the number of friends you have and how close your friendships are and the network of friends. But in this case, we've applied it to locations across the territory. The size of the circles are the number of in and outflows of primary school students through this period from 2005 to 18. So the size is the number of movements, and the weight of the lines is how well those communities are connected. So you can see somewhere like Nooka, it's hard to see the right, but this is Nooka here. It's a pretty big circle and it's moving all over the place. But in particular, when you apply this, the GEFI analysis using what's called a modularity score recognises non-random movement and looks at where people are more than random likely to move. So it maps networks. And so across the territory, there are 7 clusters that group together with non-random movement. So this is all Aboriginal students. So we've got this group in Darwin in the top end, in the light green, this pink group over in Arnhem Land, including West and East Arnhem Land, an interesting group in the blue around Nooka, and noticing that a lot of the movement is up into Arnhem Land and Groote Island. So much stronger connections for places like Umbakamba and Aliangula and Nurrugu, down through Numbawa and into Nooka and up to Minyeri than what there is to the north. There's an orange group here out of Katherine moving across to Tennant Creek, to Timber Creek, down to Yarralin and down to Kalkarinji. Interestingly though, the next community, Lanjamanu, which is also in the Katherine region, or the Big Rivers region, is much more strongly connected to Yuendamu and down into Central Australia. A group over here around Tennant Creek, and also this small group, a lot of movement between Borroloola and Robertson River. So this methodology starts to help you map what a lot of us know already, but the connection between communities, but also the strength of those connections and the number of children who are moving between those communities. Here is the non-Aboriginal students, and to make the point really that the circles are smaller, the connections are much thinner, but there are still these 7 distinct movements of non-Aboriginal children within the territory, within Darwin, within the Litchfield area, within Palmerston. Batcher-Adelaide River forms a little cluster of its own. Big Rivers, the group in Arnhem Land, but really not the same patterns or the strength of patterns we're seeing with the Aboriginal children. Where it gets more interesting is when you start to go into the regional level and you drill down and look at the movements of children who enrolled for the first time each year, in this case in East Arnhem. And for example, Galawinku, there's a very strong connection with Gapawiak. This group here, much stronger than across the Nhulunbuy. And interestingly, the pink turns up over in Warrawee as well, and also in specific suburbs in Darwin. So Milner and Wanguri is connected to the Gallawinka Gapawiak group. Over in East Arnhem, Millingimby and Ramaginning moved prominently out of East Arnhem and across to Maningrida. There's a cluster here around Yirrkala, Nhulunbuy, and what's called East Arnhem, but is the Lanapoi homelands. And here again, we see this, this clustering around Nuka, Nombawa, and Unurugu, those connections down there. So it starts to define both the scale and the connections of the movement of schools across these, in this case, 4 clusters in East Arnhem. And we've done a similar thing in Central Australia, 7 clusters in Central Australia with prominent connections. And this is most obviously the connections, for example, Yundu, Nirrupi and up to Larger Manu is the Walpri Triangle. Chichikala and Haas Bluff, Kintor, those areas, very much language based in this case, but starts to define those sorts of connections. And to come back with big rivers for the Aboriginal children, here we have these same connections we're seeing, particularly those enrolled. If you enroll in Larger Manu in a year, the movement is very strongly down to Yundamu, much more connected than, for example, to Kalkarinji. Similarly, we see this little cluster over here appearing again, the Borroloola Robinson, this one based around Nooka, going backwards and forwards in this area, but including Minyeri and Jokmingan, Mataranka, quite separate to Beswick and Barunga. And just a comment about the non-Aboriginal students, once you drill down to the level of regions, we don't see clustering of non-Aboriginal students at this sort of regional level. And as you saw in the earlier graph, the movement's much more across the territory or particularly interstate, but there's relatively low number of mobility episodes. So just to comment about latent class analysis, latent class analysis produces big, long tables with a lot of complexity, but I just want to make a couple of comments about latent class analysis. It does detect different groups of children. There are those that are stayers, those that move, but within the movers, there are those that move frequently, occasionally once off. We've got groups that move between urban and remote areas or between remote and remote areas. And we've got those that are moving interstate, intrastate, and you can look at those different groups, and then also in additional analysis, post hoc analysis, look at some of their characteristics. And a couple of the important points are firstly, as we would expect, year 3 attendance as an example, decreases as mobility increases. And that's consistent across the levels of mobility. And also the movers, and particularly the frequent movers, start moving in year 1. So that their patterns are established early and they continue to be movers. So just some final comments about the study. It's really the first time we've been able to investigate student mobility, and we've used a range of data sets and been able to apply a range of these different methods to the analysis. And like all good researchers, I end up with a question, which is what we've described is the who's moving and how they're moving and where they're moving. What we don't know is why they're moving. And that's really the next research question, is to get out there and ask people why they're moving. During the project, though, we had the benefit of reference groups in each of the 3 regions. And we talked about why kids are moving in that context and why has it increased so dramatically in the last few years. And some of the commentary were, for example, in the big rivers, is that the road systems have got much better in the last 10 years. And there's also bush buses that are going much more regularly. And so transport's improved. There's also the commentary that a big lure for movement is the Catherine Show or the Darwin Show, and also the football carnivals in Central Australia, where half the community moves to football but doesn't come back. The other candidate for people moving is housing. And in previous work, we've shown that school attendance, low school attendance, is most strongly associated with the quality of housing and overcrowding. And that's consistent with mobility. If people don't have their own house and then they're reliant on relatives, then they're moving for whatever reason in one house in a community, then they need to move on to stay with different relatives. So housing may well be a feature of mobility as well, but it's something that really needs to be asked and we need to understand. So where this is going, it really comes back to that, to the original recommendations back in 1999. The Education Department is very keen to respond to this movement, and the types of applications of this are firstly to try look at clustering communities and providing much closer association, alignment of curricula, those types of things between schools. Most obviously, if a child is not attending your school, then you should ring the network community and get them to look for the kid at the next school, and trying to get kids back into school more quickly. There's also discussion about the rigidity of putting teachers in classrooms in one community, and whether there can be more flexibility that teachers actually start to move within networks as well, so that they can respond to the sort of population movements. So there's a very active discussion in the department about how better to respond to Aboriginal mobility of Aboriginal children. Just an acknowledgement, the project was funded by the Department of Education. The project was also overseen by the CIDOB Steering Committee and the First Nations Advisory Group, who are responsible for the CIDOB data repository. And within Education Department, we had Steering Committee, Technical Advisory Group, and those advisory groups in each of the regions that provided guidance about the data and the analysis and the interpretation. So thank you.